to moderate this panel entitled, Is There Anywhere to Go But Here? Climate Change in the Global South. Before we start, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The New Orleans Film Festival is taking place on the traditional land of the Chitimacha peoples, past and present, and we would like to honor them with gratitude for their land and legacy. As a quick reminder, there will be a 15-minute question and answer session before the panel concludes. And so here we go. Is there anywhere to go but here? Climate change in the global south. As we run out of letters in the Latin alphabet to name hurricanes, 6 of which directly impacted states and countries across the global south, the Gulf South, it is an understatement that the continuous reckoning with climate change in our region is inevitable. In this panel, we will hear from filmmakers throughout the global south on how they are navigating climate change in their storytelling, daily lives, and the film ecosystem. Envisioned and curated by Chloe Walters-Wallace, Manager of Artist Programs at Firelight Media in partnership with IMA South, I am happy to be here with 4 esteemed filmmakers who have created work that centers on climate change and environmental trauma. For the sake of time, I won't read all of their bios, but I think someone will put them in the chat, and if not, you can see them on the New Orleans Film Festival site. So thank you all for being here. Hello. I know we have people calling from LA, Tennessee, San Juan, and Martinique, I believe. And I'm actually in Detroit. But hello, everyone. I'll start with the first question and give everyone an opportunity to introduce yourselves as well as you answer. So the first question is, please tell us your personal motivations that drove you to this topic of climate change and environmental trauma, and the current projects that you're working on that surround the issue. And so I think Zephyrin, we'll start with you.
Hi, so I'm Zephyrin Roy, and I'm a writer and producer from the island of Dominica. So that's not the Dominican Republic. It's a small English-speaking island, just 2 hops north of St. Lucia, and it's situated right between the French islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe. It's interesting, this question, because I never meant to tell stories on climate-related issues. These issues I've always told stories, but I always wanted to tell stories about escapades in the bush, life in the Caribbean. I wanted to tell intimate stories, rich, complex stories of people and experiences from the Caribbean that were not usually seen on screen. The kind of stories that inspired me from Caribbean writers that I had read like in growing up, like Jamaica Kincaid and Lovelace and V.S. Naipaul, etc. These were the kind of stories that I wanted to, put on screen. But I found myself like telling climate-related stories because the people around me and myself were impacted by climate change. So climate issues pervaded my storytelling, and I was really pushed into telling stories about this. The first, I think, film that we did on a climate-related issue was The Sea Between Us, and it told a story of a group of people crossing the Dominica Channel right after Hurricane Maria to establish communication with Dominica. Right after that, we also started another project that's currently in development called The Third Season, and it's a coming-of-age story of a young boy in Dominica who's lost his home and basically everything, who's had to move from Dominica, and that broaches like the question of the impact of climate change on people's lives and how it just turns people's lives around and over in the messiest ways. And so we follow this child over the period of a couple of years as he comes to terms with life after a major hurricane like Maria. And I find myself working on yet another project, another film again, this time telling the story of a 102-year-old Martinican fisherman who was facing the threat of having his home taken away from him through coastal erosion and being forced to move by the government because of this law that said that you couldn't live within a certain distance from the sea. So in a very short space of time, I found myself sort of almost forced to tell these stories because they had to be told. So I think how would I say that? I found myself facing the urgency and need to tell these stories in the same way that, climate change has made itself be felt very urgently. So this is how I've come to tell stories about climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that is inescapable, right? Yeah. And we're at a place now where we just can't ignore it. Like you said, you didn't set out to tell climate change stories, but it's reared its ugly head, and this is where we are. Okay, Lale, how about you?
Sure, staying in the Caribbean. Cool. I'm Lale. I am in the Taino land of Boriquen. I am a queer, trans feminist activist, also a filmmaker, producer, and editor. Also a DJ at the queer community. This is a really good question because I've never felt myself as an environmental activist. But in Puerto Rico, all of the fights are completely intersect. So we've been dealing with so many fights that include from pipelines, carbon, coal, energy plants, from hurricanes, droughts. We've been dealing with earthquakes. So in Puerto Rico, that's one of our layers of living here in this colonial archipelago. So it's been really part of my everyday life. So it's part of the urgency, as Stefan said. And in the past 5 years, I think all the projects I've been working one way or another have to do with environmental justice. So I think it's definitely there.
I think what's interesting too is you said that you didn't set out to be an activist, but like this film has made you one. Yeah, when I was working on my first film, Vanishing Pearls, about African-American fishermen and the aftermath of the BP oil spill, and telling the story, you find yourself, well, I found myself also in that position where you kind of set out to tell a story, but you see that it's beyond the story itself and how it impacts these people's lives and their culture and their the generations to come. So yeah, it's kind of accidental activist, but it's good work, right? Yeah, okay. Amara, let's go to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It is such an honor to be in this group. Thinking about what Lale just said about, how environmentalism is a layer of the island of Puerto Rico. I see it rings true for myself as well. So my name is Amada Torruella, and I'm a filmmaker from El Salvador, or Cuscatlan, which is now known as El Salvador. Currently, I'm in Tongva land in LA, and I guess for me it's very similar. It's that the reality of the environmental crisis in the Central American region is something that we can no longer ignore. And I say this as, a Category 5 hurricane is set to make landfall on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, and, just last week we had Hurricane Eta, and this entire hurricane season in Central America has has just, you know, again reiterated why, you know, not only is climate essential and crucial as a topic of focus and conversation these days, but also, you know, it comes to show again how climate is so linked with so many other layers of our culture, of our society, of our politics, and so it's really my heart goes out to Honduras. As a matter of fact, I'm wearing a Berta Cáceres shirt just for this panel. um, but yeah, I also, as Zephyrin was saying and Lale was saying, my journey as a storyteller, I never thought in my wildest imagination that I would be working on environmental stories. And I am developing my first feature-length documentary. It's a hybrid documentary, and it follows the journey, the life journey of a woman, and her name is Vena. She's from El Salvador, and we follow her as she fights ecocide and gender-based violence in Central America. And the project is called Vena Acuática. And I started developing this project in 2018. And it all started because I was actually on a production on a short film that had nothing to do with this. It was a short film that was being produced in Saluda, which is a rural town in South Carolina. And there's a really strong and emergent Guatemalan community in rural South Carolina. And the short film, you know, I was talking with some of our protagonists, this Guatemalan family that owned a tire shop. And he was telling me how, you know, he just really wanted to come to the United States to be able to once again own land of his own, because in Guatemala, you know, he lost his land. He lost all of his cultivos. He used to be an agricultor, and so he a farmer, and he was in the United States because he wanted to own some land again, and he lost that during a tropical storm. And from that moment on, I just, you know, I've always known this to be true as a migrant myself. Someone who has been immigrating from a very young age. I left El Salvador during the Civil War when I was 3. And so migration has always been a main topic in my storytelling. And I already knew that environmental struggles and migration were linked, but just being able to share migration stories with a fellow Central American in rural South Carolina, there was something that I just couldn't help but stop thinking about that. And I just started, you know, I went back home because all my family's in El Salvador, and I just started driving around and traveling to different areas, because just to like start interviewing people to learn more about, you know, all of the lack of investment in infrastructures that, you know, that the government has failed our country on. And with this, our team began an oral history project on environmental stories. So that's kind of, yeah.
That's amazing. And you're helping them preserve their history. That's, I mean, yeah, that's awesome work. I wanted to just kind of go back to the point of kind of us becoming accidental activists. I don't know if anybody else here went to film school, and when I went to film school, I didn't even really focus on film. I was in like the TV program. But one thing that I did learn, one takeaway that never kind of really sat right with me, was that you're not supposed to involve yourself in the story, which I get, but you know, it kind of makes you put up kind of like a wall between yourself and the protagonist in your film. But these are people with, you know, human experiences, and this is affecting their lives. And so for me, it's always been hard to disconnect from them and just have the story be the story. And it seems like we all have that same struggle, which I don't think is a bad struggle at all. Okay, Elaine, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Just thinking about the word environmental activist in that way. I have a friend, Crystal Good, who's a poet in West Virginia, and she stopped calling herself an environmentalist many years ago because it's a loaded term in West Virginia, a state that is primarily run through the mono economy of coal mining. And when she's working as a lobbyist for environmental causes, she can be written off as environmentalist. However, being an environmental advocate is something that a lot of people are, right? Even people that would prefer other jobs other than the coal industry consider themselves to be environmental advocates. And so it's a much more complicated word. And so thanks to Crystal, I've adopted that as well. So I'm Elaine. I grew up in the coal fields of West Virginia. My dad was a miner. My brother's still a miner. Everyone in my family works in the coal industry. So I grew up under the fossil fuel world, and continue to be interested in the culture created around that. The culture that is created to create a sense of purpose and belonging for the people, but is also quite convenient for the companies because it allows a controlling nature for the community to continue to uphold and allow companies to continue to dominate. And the fact is, you know, the resource curse is something I'm super interested in. It's an economic theory that maintains that countries or regions that have vast amounts of natural resources tend to have low development outcomes and higher rates of poverty and lower rates of infrastructure, lower rates of education, because there's a micro focus on getting that one resource extracted and out and very little investment locally. And I'm a product of that. So it's a very personal story. You know, the grade schools that I went to had buckets in the corner catching water. You know, they were underserviced and still are to today. Teachers are underpaid. The systems are failing. Meanwhile, billions of dollars of coal is mined by workers and is sent elsewhere for other people to have comforts and luxuries. And so I'm definitely a worker advocate as well as an environmental advocate. And I think that's really important for me because culturally, I am not in any position to shame a person for the labor that is the only decision for them to make to provide for their family. But for my film that I'm working on now, I've made many films about the coal industry and the environmental impacts of that. But right now I'm working on a film called King Coal that is a hybrid documentary that reimagines a lost land, a lost dream for Appalachia where the resource curse is not alive and well. And so we see this land being a place where it's not owned by outside landowners. The resources aren't owned by outside landowners, but everything is owned locally. And that this land is a land that has maintained more than just coal. Because on the West Virginia state flag, we have a farmer and a miner. And our state was primarily agriculture before coal began to be exploited, and now natural gas pipeline has come through. So it's a reminder, the film's a reminder of what we've lost in the pursuit of one thing, and a real question of what have we gained in that pursuit, in hopes that people can be part of a bigger conversation about the role that region has in the climate change crisis. One of my biggest conversations that I like to have around climate change is, you know, we're not experiencing in West Virginia and in Appalachia, we're not experiencing the effects of a hurricane in a direct way like your homes are, but we are experiencing a real change of biodiversity and animal migration. Growing seasons have changed and they'll continue to change. And I'm really interested in the conversation about what do we do with all these people that work in these industries across the country that we have to move on from, that we have to come up with a solution. What is the just transition, the economic transition for those families? So I see it, I'm like coming from the mountains. It's a kind of a different perspective of being both a product of the thing that is the, you know, culprit in many ways, but also trying to peel back the layers and look at the culture behind and understand like how to rebuild culture without, you know, a fossil fuel being the heart and center of it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And what you said about being a worker advocate, I feel like, and I'm relating in the best, you know, the way that I can with the fishermen and the fishing communities that I've worked with down here. a lot of times there's so much division between the environmentalists and the communities that actually live on the coast here, because the environmentalists say that they are contributing to the loss of land along the Louisiana coast. But the fishermen saying that you're coming up with alternatives that won't allow me to continue to live on this land. So I think that's interesting. One other thing that you brought up, both you and Amada brought up, and feel free, Lale and Zephyrin, if this relates to you all too, to kind of chime in, but you all talked about having difficult conversations when it comes to climate change and environmental trauma, and how you're using different storytelling techniques to get your protagonists in the film to open up and to take part in those conversations. Can you talk about that? And then also why you think it's difficult for them to have these conversations, kind of the complexity around that. Elaine, you can go first.
Yeah, well, in the most recent film, I mean, my work up until this point has been completely observational and verite. So this is a complete departure for me, and it's kind of scary in that way. But I'm choosing this form of having magical realism elements because I do think the conversation that I'm wanting to have, it's so burdened by our shorthand for one another and our tropes, and the conversation can sort of transcend our current politics around coal and everything around it that just belittles and reduces one another to catchy headlines. I just don't roll with that. I mean, I became a storyteller because I grew up in a region that has been so poorly misrepresented and continues to be on a national level. And that's why I became a storyteller. So like subverting those headlines and showing what's beneath those, and actually not calling a place, writing it off as Trump country, but understanding that not everyone voted for Trump, and there's actually people fighting, and there's people that are resilient, and there's people that are trying every single day to make change. So those are the stories I'm interested in. So that's why using this form of magical realism allows me to, in many ways, rewrite history and future, which is what I'm interested in doing. Because the documentary elements of it are very much rooted in looking at the culture around coal. And so the very observational approach of looking at how that actually plays out. But the conversation that I'm able to start by using magical realism is tapping into that emotional side that everyone in the region feels. I mean, Zephyrin, you talked about being inspired by writers and poets from your region. I mean, the same thing. I mean, Louise McNeil is a poet from my region who was writing about the same things that I'm dreaming up in my magical realism film, and having these conversations in a way, you know, she's been gone for many years, and having these conversations in a way in which allows people to put aside the labels that we have applied and like lift up and play, like add some lightness and realize that there's some daily life and some culture and some things that we all have in common that we can meet in the middle and like work from there. And so that's what I'm interested in, because I grew up with a father who would come home very upset in the evenings because he would go to work and there would be picketers at his mine, and they, you know, he felt completely assaulted by the environmentalists. So a very skewed view of these two worlds, right? And it's been a really personal and trying experience to pivot around what I was seeing and what I was taught when I was younger, and having nuanced conversations with my family and learning that they too are traumatized by the clear cutting that's happening across the state, when an entire, you know, 200 acres is completely slashed and burned, because if they leave even a twig, they'll get taxed, and the company doesn't want to pay that tax, and there's no reclamation of the land. Like, they too are bothered by that. And so I've been able to like jump from both sides with my experience and understand that there's a lot of nuance. And because of that, there's no one that's really speaking. There's no one that really has that voice in the region right now. And it's partly because the voice has been so shut down. And so that's why I wanted to create a fictional character that really represents that levity and that voice, that represents the internal soul, the connection people feel with land that maybe has been squished out, but is deep inside. And it's the motivating factor in which we can save the future, can save the land, and can make it a place that people can live, that can have clean water, they can have things to raise their children on. And so yeah, it's kind of like a deep internal struggle to figure out how to have a conversation that doesn't just start another fight.
Yeah, I think that Elaine is pointing to a lot of common themes that I think this entire group found when we talked the last time. And first of all, it's the fact that as filmmakers creating stories within the environmental canon, like we are pushing ourselves to find new languages to be able to talk about these issues, because we're all coming from perspectives that normally are not represented or are gravely misrepresented, as Elaine was saying. And same as Elaine, in my story, that's why I've put together a fictional character, because it's narrative techniques and narrative modes that are allowing for me to put together a story that shows this other side of Central America and of El Salvador. The other thing that Elaine pointed out too, that I think that we were all talking about too, was the fact that it's really needed to tell these stories of climate change through other lenses. And in my case, it's the same thing too, because I come from a region that the war in El Salvador, for example, didn't end that long ago. It ended in 1992. And so we're still in a post-war era. And so right now we have been used to having narratives being told to our people through the perspective of an outside force. And it's a moment right now in time when we're seeing more perspectives being able to join the storytelling landscape and saying, there are other sides to the story, there are other perspectives, there are things that are missing. And that's what I like about this group, is that I feel that we all come from areas that have had not only their natural resources extracted, but also their stories. And that is just, it's maddening to me. And so with Vena Aquatica, the idea is to shift the perspective that a lot of our people in El Salvador have, that forget that that there's so much more past the criminalization of gang violence. There's also a look at the infrastructures that haven't been upkept by our governments, and also a lack of connection with the land, as Elaine was pointing out. And I think that that's so important, and that's also where I intersect with thinking about just the militarization of the land, how that how the militarization of the US-Mexico border has been exported all the way to Central America. And that's also another way. And as I was saying last time, I think that throughout this entire process, what has been extremely eye-opening for me is that I've realized that regions like ours, regions like Puerto Rico, like Martinique and Dominica and West Virginia and El Salvador, they are the natural resource. They are the resource. And El Salvador has the lowest water reserves in all of Central America. And there's a reason for that. Our economy is working to be able to supply water, sand, sugar to countries, and we're forgetting about the people that are left behind, that haven't been taught or haven't been sustaining themselves, because they're doing it in other ways that it makes them put themselves last and forget to care for their own ecosystems. And of course there's different efforts happening on the ground level, people that are coming in to support these farmers, but at the same time there's just a lot that needs to shift. Our economies need to shift. and also the way that the stories are being told need to shift.
Yeah.
I just want to jump in there to add to what Elaine you were saying, and Amada. There are definitely things that resonate so strongly with me, Elaine, with your forms of narratives and how you're shaping your storytelling and the techniques that you're using to be able to tell your stories. And Amada, when you talk about this, stories being stolen or the narrative being monopolized in some way, it just brings to mind how the countries from the global north, who are mainly responsible for consuming the quota in terms of climate, and who creating this form of climate bankruptcy, and they're in debt, and they're using the quotas of these countries who are contributing very little to this climate debt. They are still the ones who are defining what stories can or should be told and how these stories should be told. And I think it's very important that the filmmakers and countries from the global south, because we position ourselves very strongly to tell these stories that we want to tell, the stories that we deem are important. There's something that Amada said that really struck me when I think of this film that we were working on and we had to stop because of COVID, because it's being filmed in Dominica and we're currently in Martinique. We're telling the story of this young boy who, he's picking up the pieces of his life after Maria, even though Hurricane Maria happened like in 2017 and we're in 2020. This is a child who was 10 when the hurricane happened, who lost his home, etc. What we see when something that happens is very often the narrative, it's how would I say that? We often see the same thing, the same kind of stories that are being told. But we seldom see stories that show people in the realness of who they are, the complexity of what they live in, the ways that they're building resilience, or the things that they're doing or they're putting in place that are very creative, very innovative, the spirit that they have, the poetry that they bring into these techniques or mechanisms that they put into place in to survive. There's one thing that the young boy that we're working with that he does that's that probably links it to what you were talking about, Elaine, in terms of magical realism. He's created this whole other world where he's a merman. And he's created this sort of parallel world where he lives under the water. So he goes to the river a lot. So Dominica is known as a land of 365 rivers. It's a nature island of the Caribbean, very green, etc. So he goes to the river a lot. And, whenever he enters the water, he tells us the story. He becomes a merman, and there's this whole world underneath the water where, there are rules, etc. And when he's not supposed to go on land and mix with, normal human beings. It's really very interesting because the character of this young boy, just outside of this world that he's created, he's really a normal young boy interested in all the things that boys are interested in, etc. So it's interesting for us to look at how he's created this world and what this says about how he perceives the world that he's living in, how it helps him to, to face the reality that is now his. And it brings us to question, what are other people doing? How are other people in places that are really affected by climate change? What do they put in place also? How do they mentally, psychologically, come to terms with this reality? And I think this is something that I really take to heart, like to explore in terms of storytelling and reclaiming narratives or narrative in a certain way and telling those stories. I think how would I say that now? It reminds me of something else that we spoke about when we first spoke as a group. Maybe that's a question that you might ask Naila about financing. because when the kind of stories that are told and how they can be told are defined elsewhere, the financing is also defined like elsewhere. It's determined elsewhere, and its limits also how you can tell a story, the kind of story that you can tell. So definitely those are things that like they resonate with me, and yeah. I don't know how you all feel about that.
Absolutely. One other thing that Amada said that stuck with me, that struck me, you said that they're not only extracting our resources, they're extracting our stories. And I mean, I think that connects to what you were just talking about, Zephyr. I mean, that's super powerful. And so just to follow that up, I would like you all to kind of talk about the importance, and Zephyr, you already started it, about people from the regions telling those stories. But then if we could also kind of pivot into how having outside voices come in, extract those stories, how that kind of feeds into the whole disaster capitalism problem that we're having. I think that's a function of it. And I mean, if you disagree, you can tell me that. But I think that's like a very interesting maybe thought to explore. Lale, can you tell us about your experience? If you have anything to add.
Sure. Environmental trauma, environmental racism, those are terms that, because this is a Spanish-speaking country, those terms stay basically in academia. So we don't talk with those terminologies usually. So when we're gonna go and when we start conversations, because at the end of the day, I am a very new filmmaker. I never thought I was gonna end up making films. I'm a film school dropout. I think it all starts with conversations. And then I come from the Caribbean, half Dominican, half Puerto Rican. Communication is very easy for us. We love talking, but then suddenly you talk about, let's talk about trauma. And it's like, what trauma? So it's especially for a colony, it's very difficult for us to pinpoint what is the trauma, what specifically is the trauma. So many layers of trauma. This conversation is beautiful because so many things have stuck with me, especially the fight for land, the militarization of land. It's Puerto Rico, 85% of the food is imported. So it's not a coincidence. And the fight for land is so, so important. Basically with climate change, our crops, we don't have the small island, the small lands that we have, crops go bad. We have very different seasons, rainy, drought. So when we start talking about the experience, everybody just wants to explode with so many experiences, so many things that they want to talk about. I remember the specific date I was doing this, when this happened, and this other date. And then the thing with experiences, specifically in Puerto Rico, is that we feel experiences as absolute, and we feel that our experience is the same experience as everybody else. So I think that's one of the biggest retos, how do you say that in English? Challenges, yes, thank you. The biggest challenges to put together stories, so many experience, so many opinions, and then to try to put that together, I think that's the most beautiful thing. But when you come people from outside, specifically for us in Puerto Rico, we've been dealing with this colonizing issue forever, and since Maria, it's been triple the effect. It makes me as myself, can I as a filmmaker, as a documentalist that I want to be, can I go to another place and make a story of that place and a story that is not basically mine, or it doesn't resonate with my story? It's a question that I ask even Cecilia, that's my mentor, Cecilia Garondo. And that's a beautiful question. It's very important. That's basically what I need to focus, like if I want to do that. But for me, that's the question. Can I go to another place and do a story, or do archival work, or just go through their stories and not feel that they're mine or I'm part of it? I think it's very difficult.
Yeah, I think that also going back to what you were asking, Naila, is that there's there's definitely, I mean, harm done when you aren't working in alignment with what benefits the community the most. And I think that that's something that everybody in this group understands. And like in the case in El Salvador is that we have now with COVID-19, we're having these conversations around accumulated grief, el duelo acumulado, that we've just inherited of like, you know, of 12 years of war, and then, you know, once the war is over, you have foreign investments come into your country, and because now the land is profitable, right? It's like worthy of some type of support, but there isn't really much, you know, there isn't space given to the communities that, you know, for example, in the case of West Virginia, it's the same. I feel there isn't like an opportunity for the communities that you are entering to tell a story, to grieve. There isn't an opportunity to process, to heal from, you know, accumulated layers of trauma. And so I think that that's also, you know, a place where you can begin to try to collaborate with the participants of your film in a different way. I think that a lot of the oral history project that I've been working on for the past few years has been to center the most vulnerable communities in my country, the ones that are, you know, experiencing all of this head on, whether it's water privatization, and so you have a very low access to water. In some cases, some of our protagonists have, you know, have an hour of water every 4 days, which is mind-boggling. And so, and that's just extending, right? Sometimes it's the hurricanes, like right now, earthquakes. It's another thing that Elaine mentioned, the change of the landscape. You know, there's so many areas that should be wetlands and that now are going through a desertification process, you know? And so I think that it's about being able to collaborate with those that you are participating in your film, and collaborate with them in a way that you can have conversations and spaces where you're like allowing them to process kind of like what has happened. And, you know, in this particular case, what's happening right now in Central America with Iota and ETA, like it's a really good example, because the last really devastating hurricane was 22 years ago, Hurricane Mitch in 1998. And now we're at the same place again, but everybody is abandoned. And so, you know, that leaves a lot to say when it comes to all of these other narratives that were coming out of Central America. I don't know if that makes sense. If we find ourselves in the same place we did 22 years ago, but instead it's actually worse. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I want to add on that a bit to say that I think that all the narratives that have been created around the places we're from are not unintentional. I think that if you are from a place with rich resources, it is within the interests of people who have control of those resources to make that place seem void of value for other than its coal, other than its water, other than its sugar, right? So the campaign done around the region of Appalachia, it started previous to the war on poverty with the LBJ. Lyndon B. Johnson flew Air Force One over Appalachia and took people porch to porch in West Virginia and Kentucky to show the poverty. A well-intentioned stunt that actually just made the region further look helpless. And and completely void of any humanity. And from that point forward, there's been no return of seeing the region for something that there's something worth saving. I mean, the people have been told that their most valuable resource is coal. And after a certain period of time, you believe that. You don't believe in the human capital anymore. You don't believe in the human resources that are actually more valuable. And something that really resonated with what Zephyrin was saying to me was this idea of the innovation of making things and remaking things. It's something that is alive and well in Appalachia and always will be, because the lack of resources of modern things is often limited. So you make do with what you have. And there's some ingenious things that are invented, right? With, just time and repurpose. And for my film, I've been working on trying to reimagine and repurposing things like these are the goggles that these are the goggles that you see into the magical world with. And so using actual mosses and flowers, and these are made by my friend Dale Mackey. And I have coal goggles too, that are like the version of that for coal, but actually thinking of like how to bring, when you're telling a story about a place, you want the people who are from that place to see it and it feel like an authentic version of them, right? I don't want people to see this film, I don't care what side of the aisle they're on, and feel like it was made from someone that's not from that place. And I think that that's a real issue in the American documentary industry, because nobody lives in these places, right? I live in Knoxville, Tennessee, which is 4 hours from where I previously lived. I just moved here, but I'm in the region, and there's so few people that want to actually dig in and devote time to these places, because it's sometimes more challenging to figure out how to support yourself. There's a lot of challenges that go along with it, but for me it's worth it because it means I have skin in the game. And it means that when I go to the grocery store, or I drink the same water that the people I film drink, right? I have to deal with the same filtration system. I have to deal with the same water outages. Those types of things matter when it comes to building trust and actually representing stories that I think break down that very intentional media bias that's been painted to like make all the places we're from seem as places to just take from, and not places that have things to offer beyond that extractable resource.
Wow. That was a great point. If I could finish the panel right on that point, I would, but we have a little bit more time. So one thing that we brought up, but I just want to say, I think you all are doing phenomenal work as filmmakers, like you said, with skin in the game, telling stories from places that you live in, that you care about. And, I think we can all see the people that we are putting on camera in ways that other people can't, right? I think that's important. I think it's very important. But I do want to go back to what Zephyrin brought up, and it's from a concern that Elaine brought up earlier, and it's about who's financing these environmental films. I know when I was working on my piece, people would say, just get BP to fund your film. And I was like, that's going to discredit my entire doc. So anyway, I want to we can kind of wrap it up, but talking about the frustration maybe around financing and who is actually putting money into quote unquote environmental films and their motivations, and what you all are running up against as you go out there and seek funding. Does anybody want to go first? I'll ask Elaine because you brought it. Oh, Zephyrin took us off mic first. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to jump in because I'll probably be fast. I think that one of the issues that, something that you said resonated with me, Elaine, was when you live, there are certain areas that are deemed to be story worthy, but not good places to live. So you live elsewhere and then you get funded and you fly in. You stay for a short while, immerse yourself with the population, like you're some, 1930s ethnologist or anthropologist or something, and then you come out with like this Oscar-worthy documentary. So we live in the Caribbean, worthy for a lot of things, but when it comes to surviving as like a documentary filmmaker, tough. When it comes to accessing like a network, tough. You know, events, etc. Things that keep you, like, give you this foundation and, like, you know, keeps you going, like, in the long game. So I think that maybe the first thing that I would say is you have very limited visibility as to who funders are. You have to, I think, be quite savvy in terms of tech and networking, so you can connect to people, get into networks, and find out how things work, because there's no ecosystem that, you know, locally that you can, like, plunge into that just opens that this space for you. So you really have to, like, grapple with it yourself. Once you get into that, you will see, I think, the big, you know, big names. But there are a lot of other things that you're not going to see, that you're not going to have access to, just because of where you are. I don't know if this is your experience, Lali, maybe a bit less, because Puerto Rico is connected to the US. So you probably have access to different things compared to, like, maybe other, like, independent Caribbean islands. So that's a first point for me in terms of, like, financing for film. I think the other point that I would make is, and this is an experience that I've had presenting, you know, our films and looking for funding, is I think there's a lack of interest in the kind of stories that we're telling. When I say this, I mean, if the story does not fit a certain form or an idea of what the Caribbean should look like, or what a story from the Caribbean should look like, it's usually something that it's going to be either connotated with there's going to be misery or poverty, or it's reggae music and I don't know, you know, Jamaican gangsters, or or it's like what's that film, the bobsledders. Wonderful film that, of course, everybody
Cool
loves.
Runnings. Cool Runnings. Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
You know, that vibe, or, you know, or it's going to be like a reportage style, very journalistic, you know, where you have the voice of God telling you something, what to think. But just like observational style documentaries from St. Vincent, Grenada, Dominica, Barbados, like, how many of those have you seen? Do you see? It's so few. And this is an obstacle that we've had, like, in looking for funding, this sort of non-interest. And I had one particular experience where one story that I remember we pitched in different places. I remember one year we pitched it, and the following year, so we didn't get funding for it, and the following year we went to a major festival, one of the biggest doc festivals, and the same theme was there, but from a filmmaker from the global north coming to tell a story, like this same exact thing. Now, of course, you know, I'm saying this pure coincidence, but what is it that makes it that these people would come with this idea, not get funding, and then these filmmakers would come with the same idea and then get funding? So I think there is very often, I think, bias in, you know, the process of funding, or who is eligible for funding. It's not just you know, according to the criteria of where you're from, you know, the technical points of the story, and even creative points. I think there are other things that come into play. You know, is it does it fit this the selling points that we want right now? You know, those things. And it's, for me, it's really unfortunate. I'm just going to go back very quickly to something that you said in the beginning, Naila, about you know, why we tell these stories. That was the first question. And I love the place that I come from. Like, I'm from Dominica, nature island of the Caribbean, and, like, this is my home. My heart is in the place. So while I've been sort of forced to tell climate related stories, I love my home so much that I feel compelled to tell them, and I'm happy to tell them if they can make a difference, you know? And so I feel like it's so unfortunate that the stories that we want to tell that impact people's lives in the most serious and real way, that we have these obstacles, you know, when we in telling them. But there's something that I read, you know, recently that stuck with me, and I'll finish with that. It's when environmentalists or environmental advocates and scientists started talking about the dangers of climate change and global warming, etc., decades ago, they presented a lot of facts and figures and, you know, science, the science of it, and they thought that it was going to be alarming enough for people to change and to realize that, you know, we have to do something, we have to change now. But the fact of the matter is, people are not touched by facts. They're not touched by data. They're touched by stories and emotion. And this is where we come in. And I think this is why, like, I still feel driven to tell those stories and to move past those obstacles like the financing. And we end up actually financing, self-financing our projects.
I'm gonna jump in real quick. So we would think that Puerto Rico, being a colony of the U.S., we would get a little bit more help or financial help for different projects. But as an independent artist, I can tell you it's so difficult. When you would find a link for a grant and you will start filling it up, you wouldn't find Puerto Rico as one of the countries. Then you would select United States, but we're not a state. So you would not appear. Puerto Rico does not exist. We started existing right after Maria hit us and covered us completely. So it's been almost about 3 years that we started appearing as part of scrolling down of the countries on the grants. But if you are actually able to submit to these funds or grants, usually they only pick one person from marginalized groups. So it would be Amada or me as persons from Spanish-speaking countries. So it's so difficult to get funding. So at the end of the day, we fund ourselves, and we learned to do amazing things, sometimes with just $100. So yeah.
Yeah, I just want to add and say that the way that filmmakers, this is across the board, are trained and encouraged to write about their projects for the funding audience makes me uncomfortable. The language that has to be used in a proposal to speak about the very people and land that I love, almost in a subject or in an objective way rather than in a personal way in which I feel it so deeply. You know, if that's one of the reasons I'm so hesitant to apply for a specific, you know, environmental grant specifically, because I've gotten the comment before of like, what's the impact? What's the climate change impact? And I think that it's very tricky to put a box around, you know, a film and be able to check it if you've made impact in such a massive, massive thing that we're facing globally, when the reality is that every film that is about this issue is adding to the ecosystem of the films. It's not about one film making the change. And it's unrealistic, and we're forced to speak unrealistically about our films and the things they can do, when really we are trying to move people, right, into action. Maybe we have specific actions, but that's the first step. And so I'm always just hesitant because people will have expectations, right? And so I've been featuring this film in more of a human interest story more than an environmental story. Of course, it's completely underpinned by the environment. But it's the human story that's the lead on it. And so I'm just leery of the expectations associated with those types of funds on a region that because I care that this region be part of the conversation. I'm not trying just to speak to the outside. And the reason I think that this is important, and Zephyrin, I've been in the same situation where I've been pitching or even trying to like get my film into a festival, and a film that's about my region, that's told by a director that's won a lot more awards and has been around the block way more times than me, will get in and will get the money to tell a story that's in my backyard, even though I've been telling it. And that's very common because he or she is a safer bet for them, right? For an audience perspective. But I don't lose hope and confidence in that, because every single film that I've made, that I can rest easy at night knowing that I made it ethically and made it true to the people that gave me their stories and allowed me to spend that time, there's an audience there for. I mean, my very first project, raising a majority of the money on Kickstarter, being true to the community that participated in the making of it and being true to them into the distribution of it all the way to the end, and the language and how we spoke about it, it's still probably the most successful project I've had audience-wise, because it was authentic and true. And so while it's frustrating sometimes to feel like there's not as much geographical diversity as I'd like to see on that scale of funding and on programming, I know that there's an audience because I've made one for it over and time again. And I will continue to find them, because there's a lot of people that feel the same as us and are tired of the same old stories. I mean, look at the blowback right now from Hillbilly Elegy, Ron Howard's new film. I mean, that film is getting incredible blowback, and people are tired. You know, I think that we're all tired of just accepting tropes of one another. And there are audiences out there that want the stories that we are telling from these perspectives. And eventually the industry, and in some ways it's come a long way in the past 5 years, then eventually the industry will catch up, and those voices will be valued just as much as the ones that can win them awards.
I think, were you just snapping, Lovely? Is that what I saw? Okay, yeah. Yeah, that deserves snaps. No, this whole conversation, you all are, I mean, amazing, you know, powerhouses. I think the way that you're approaching film, with the intentions behind it, I mean, if we need more of that in the industry, and hopefully we'll have more of that going forward. We were supposed to wrap 7 minutes ago with this portion of it, but before I do, and it looks like we only have one question, is there anything else anyone wants to add? No. Okay. I mean,
I wanted to add one last thing, and it's just, you know, it's encouraging to be a part of this group also, because it reminds me that, you know, not only are we all trying to tell stories, environmental stories in a unique way, in our own way, and trying to, like, you know, create our own voice within cinema, but also we have to remember that, you know, sometimes if we're really expecting for the film industry to become rich, then we also have to expect for new type of storytellers to come into the fold. And so I look at this group and I'm like, you know, what does, you know, cinema from West Virginia look like? How does, you know, how does Dominica and Martinique play into global cinema? You know, what does Salvadoran cinema look like? Because you know, like, there's so much room for growth when there's clearly a lot missing when you don't see those movements being explored by your own communities. You know, there's such a hunger for that, a personal hunger for that. And I think that it's something that's shared with so many other people, like the amazing people in this group.
If I can just jump in to say one last thing, Naila, there's something that is really important, I think, especially for smaller islands who have the threat of like disappearing with like coastal erosion, but also just completely being wiped out when a major natural disaster hits. I think in particular, like, you know, smaller chains of islands in the Bahamas. As we're wrapping up, there's something that came to mind that I had a conversation on our podcast Film and Impact with this documentarian, Tamika Galanis, who's from the Bahamas. And we were talking about how people, when they are living the effects of climate change, of after natural disaster, for example, whatever it might be, they're very preoccupied with just piecing their lives back together. They're very preoccupied with, finding a new home or finding how they're going to get to work, just things like that, or where their children are going to live if they have to send them elsewhere. For example, my family from Dominica was like just massively displaced after Maria. And in that move, where of the movement of people, what we see is we start losing landmarks that are very important. These are not just monuments. I'm talking about landmarks that can be as simple as the red crabs that come out at a certain time of the year during hurricane season, that are linked to a tradition of collecting these crabs to cook a certain meal. These are things that are strongly linked to our culture. They're strongly linked to our identity. They're strongly linked to the fabric of who we are as people. And in the immediate aftermath of climate trauma, we don't think about that. And people, when you approach this topic of climate change and the consequences and how it's important to address these, etc., and why it's important for us that we're coming to you to make this kind of films, they're not necessarily immediately interested because they don't see the impact, but it's there. We don't measure it right away, but we're losing just huge pieces of history, of people, of heritage. And I would, just close by saying, like, the role, as Amada was saying, that it's so important, these different storytellers who are piecing back together, making like a patchwork of the things that we might lose, the things that we're losing, and maybe in terms of archival storytelling, the things that maybe we've lost, and we try to, piece them back together so we can preserve something moving forward.
Absolutely. All right, I'm gonna switch over to the question and answer, although I feel like we could talk all night. But we have two questions. So the first one is, who are the audiences that you all prioritize for the specific types of work you're doing, and how do you meet them through your storytelling?
I just want to say that it's about understanding the language of the audience. And so for me, it's hard to define more than one audience because that feels almost impossible. Like, you could say the audience is the world, right? You want everyone to see your film. But like at the end of the day, I think of audiences like, who would I be heartbroken if they didn't feel moved by this, didn't see this, and it didn't affect them. And ultimately, it's the people that are within regions similar to Appalachia, whether that's in other continents that are in the exact same resource curse. That is my audience. And so it's speaking that language of understanding the resilience behind that destruction, understanding that there's joy still, even in moments of poverty and pain, and being able to find those very human moments. And that's the language that my audience, which is the ones that have lived through an incredible amount of degradation of their environment, will resonate with, because they are sick and tired of being painted as victims no matter what country they live in. And so they will resonate with being seen as more than their poverty porn, which is what has been made of them. So that is the defining that audience. And then hopefully, the rest of the world will see moments in it that they can relate to as well, because these are all universal stories. We're all telling universal stories. Every story has to exist in a place, right? Every story has to be somewhere. And I just want to say one other thing is, I do feel I've moved back home. It's been almost, wow, how long has it been? It's been like 7 years since I moved back to Appalachia and started just like, I'm going to make work here. And I've come and gone a couple of times, but mostly been here. And I will say, after 7 years of just going at it, this year has been a huge blessing. And like, so many funders have come to the table for this project. And I really don't think that would have been possible if I wouldn't have just like lived for free in a house I wasn't paying for and made the work every day and didn't have student debt, have a lot of privilege of not having debt and not having to make that much money and living in a very cheap place so that I can live very cheaply. There's many things that assisted me in doing so, but I think that perseverance of like seeing 7 years of work through, even in really, really tough times when like my tax bracket that I was in was like incredibly low and I still had to pay taxes and I was crying. I was like, how am I going to pay these taxes? I just remember those years of just being like, I don't know how to even make money here. But I feel like it's finally come to a head where the funders are saying, okay, you've stayed, you've done this. And I'm teaching now, and I'm trying to teach my students that there's so much opportunity. You're from this region. There's so many stories to share. And so everybody leaves. So like invest. And so it just goes back to the audience of like, defining who your audience is. It often allows you to invest more deeply in their language, in their culture, to make sure that that's the language of the film.
Absolutely. I find myself often faced with that question, particularly with applications, and kind of moving from a place of educating people to saying, no, my audience is the people that you see in the film, and I want this film to be a reflection of them. I want them to be able to see themselves and celebrate themselves. Zephyr, were you jumping in?
Yeah, I was jumping in, just saying I think Elaine sort of like spoke for all of us. I think because I think it's definitely our desire that our goal is that the people who are in our film, that they see themselves and people similar to them. For me, like in the Caribbean, like my greatest joy is when people from here, from the islands, they see our films and they just engage with it like so much, and they say, oh my God, I love that story. I can relate to that, like this character, this person, this thing that happened. And like, you get this. For me, this is definitely the audience, like, that we're aiming for.
All right, I'm gonna move on over to the second question. It's the last question that we have. Climate change affects us all, but how can we be mindful of extractive storytelling when trying to address it? Someone mentioned the stories as a resource earlier. I think that was you, Amada, but anybody can take this.
Well, I think that thinking about this question, it all depends. I think that we're in a current moment in time with just how the media landscape has been infused with misinformation that we've realized. I feel that context is very important, and I feel that the analysis of context within various situations has been lost. And so I was just thinking about this question. I think that every case is different, every story is different. You have to look at the context, right? That's kind of like where I'm trying to go. And I think that first of all, it's important to show that you're mindful and that you are addressing if there is a potential of you extracting a story. Addressing it head on from the very beginning is very important, in the sense that you have to create partnerships and relationships with either the group of people that you're making this story with or for, or the community that you are working within. And I see this question a lot, and I don't think that I would be able to answer it like right here, right now, but I know that it's something that at least in our southern region, we're in the southern region of the United States, and I say our southern region, and I know I'm in California, but I as a as an immigrant in this country, South Carolina was my first home, so I love it a lot, and I will see forever as a Southerner, and you know, people like Elaine have welcomed me, so that's great. But you know, we have this great group, which is, you know, a big reason why this whole panel was put together, and it's called the Indie Media Arts South, and you know, it's a topic of conversation that is very, very important to us, and part of it is, you know, not only creating relationships so that you can, you know, support the visions of those that are existing in the regions, but also, you know, hold yourself accountable from the very beginning, and you know, try to set agreements or partnerships with those that you're, you know, making the story with, right? And so I think that it's definitely a case by case situation, but context is very important, I feel, if hopefully that makes sense.
I think I agree with Ahmad on this point, and it sort of, you know, circles back to something that you were saying earlier, Neil, about immersing yourself in your character's story and being taught that you shouldn't do that. And I personally think that this is something that you cannot not do. I think you, of course, you need to have some form of distance, you know, whenever you're telling a story, but I do think that you have to create some human connection. You need to understand the people that whose story you're telling, and you need to understand it not from the point of view of, oh, this is a good story, you know, I'm gonna get a good hit with this one. You have to understand it from, you know, why am I telling this story, and how is it going to impact the people? And I think when you start asking these questions, you know whether you're doing, you know, you're just extracting or taking away from the people for your own gain. If you're trying to have them gain something with it, then, you know, you create more of a balance. And when I say gain, I mean this gain can be anything. You were talking about impacts earlier, Elaine. I'm sorry if you can hear my dog. I locked him outside for this panel. He's not very happy. But yeah, you can create some form of balance, and you can have some form of honesty with yourself. And I really like what you said earlier, Elaine, when you said, you spoke about having this sort of clear conscience and sleeping well at night, knowing that you've created your films ethically. You know, that you've asked yourself these questions and that you can answer, if you've answered honestly, so you know that you've told your stories honorably.
Right, and that doesn't mean there's not going to be things that make your audience that you're aiming to reach uncomfortable, right? It's not about painting a rosy picture or painting a bleak picture either way. It's about being honest. And that's difficult for audiences to see sometimes, but it's the good medicine, right? Like you're providing that medicine that's not harsh, but is actually the soul medicine that we need. And I was going to say something, you said something that made me think, what was the question again? About, collaboration. So one of the things that drives me crazy is a lot of people want to make stories here in Appalachia from elsewhere. And they want, this has gone very badly in the past, and it's gone well in the past. I've had different experiences of being a fixer or a producer for someone with no impact on what will happen with it in the end. And I've been treated very nicely by some people. Like I did a lot of the pre-production for the Anthony Bourdain Parts Unknown episode in West Virginia. And that was a real honor because they treated it very seriously. And they did 2 weeks of pre-production where I drove them around the state, introduced them to people, and they treated the people I introduced them to, who were long-standing connections of mine. Most of them were in documentaries I had already made. Well, they treated them with respect. And I think what is so frustrating is when you're the fixer or the producer and you're making these connections for someone, and then they just ditch that person, or they don't give them a reason of why they didn't show up, or they treat them differently than they would have treated someone in their own backyard because they don't feel that connection. So I think it's the biggest way. I'm not such a guard dog in the sense of like, you can't tell a story in my region, because I personally can't do it all. Like, I don't want to tell every story. I can only tell the certain stories I can. But I do think there's ethical ways to do it that use locals and the resources that they can provide for your stories, and not a transactional way that's greedy. Some documentary filmmakers can be so greedy where they show up to the scene and they hit record and they go, right? They're not really that interested in that off-camera relationship that we know locally we have to make. And so that's my biggest piece of advice. And that's the biggest thing I see when people do come to the region, is they don't want to take that extra time to get that off-screen relationship, because that is so translated on screen. Like, that person's going to trust you so much more. He's going to take you to so many more layers of their life if they feel like you're not just there when the record button's lit up, right? If you're actually there, if you actually care about them as a person, like beyond a subject in your film, like if they're treated in that transactional way, and if you treat people that I connect you with in that transactional way, like I won't help you again. Like that's just that's not cool. You can't do that. People are not to be used in that way. So that's just, I mean, I think one of the big things IMAS, the Indie Media Arts South group, is trying to do is raise the profile of Southern makers, because there's a wealth of people out there, but sometimes they're lacking equipment. Sometimes they're lacking the visibility they need. And so you don't always have to fly in your person from New York to do sound. There's often someone that can do it, but you're going to need to rent them gear and pay them well, right? Rent gear for other people, you can rent gear for them. So, I think what we want to do is try to raise the visibility of the resources, the human resources that are here, that are to be valued, and not to be used as like, I don't know, you see some like places like Vice News come in and steal people's stories that they've been working on for years. I know it's happened in New Orleans a couple times, and stuff like that is just heartbreaking to watch go down.
Yeah. All right, everyone. We're a bit over time, but I think we had a great conversation. Thank you all for participating in Is There Anywhere to Go But Here? Climate Change in the Global South. Thank you all for watching. And I mean, I hope this conversation continues. This has been amazing. Thank you all. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So nice to talk with you guys.
Yeah.
Why, same.